I was not supposed to be there. That is the first thing I will tell you, and I will tell it plainly, because the record I am filing has to be accurate, and I have no interest in softening it with the kind of careful language the Accord's communications offices use when they want something to read as regrettable rather than catastrophic. My role was trade liaison, classification civilian, attached to the diplomatic arm of the Vethran Accord's Ninth Consolidation Fleet, for an operation that our commanders described, in the official briefing language, as a long overdue administrative correction. I carried a ledger. I reviewed import tariff classifications and territorial survey forms and the treaty framework precedents that established the Accord's jurisdictional claim. I had spent the preceding 4 years building the legal architecture that authorized the fleet to be assembled in the first place, 47 separate documents, some of them 40 pages long, each of them adding one more layer to the argument that the Keth Corridor was sovereign Accord territory, and that the human installation currently occupying it had forfeited any claim by ignoring the eviction notice for 340 years. 47 documents. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it represents an enormous investment of institutional effort, and the thing it bought us is the subject of this transmission. I am Clerk Liaison 2nd Grade Osith Tavan Verath, and I am transmitting this record from the tender vessel Quiescent Meridian at a position I am not disclosing in this communication for reasons that will become clear. I am transmitting it in full, under my own name, on my own authority, because I helped build the case for this expedition, and I was present for its result, and the archive of the Accord deserves an honest accounting of both. I do not know what the Council's communications office will say when the silence from the Ninth Consolidation Fleet becomes impossible to explain. I do not know what version of events will eventually appear in the official record. I know what I saw, and I am filing it because the 31 clerks who worked on this docket before me deserve to know that the file they spent their careers constructing was, in the end, a document that a garrison of human soldiers used to anticipate our arrival and prepare for it. Let me begin at the actual beginning, not the day the fleet departed, not the day we arrived at the corridor. The actual beginning is 340 years ago, because that is when the shape of everything that followed was established, and no one who reviewed the subsequent docket entries ever fully reckoned with what the shape was. The Keth Corridor dispute is recorded in the archive's territorial files as docket 7741C if you pull that file, and I am attaching a full copy to this transmission, because there is something important about reading the whole thing from the beginning now that you know how it ends. The first substantive entry is dated 340 years, 6 cycles, and a handful of days ago. It is a standard form eviction notice, and it is as thorough a document as the Accord's administrative offices produce. The Accord had identified the corridor as strategically valuable for reasons that are still true. It is the most direct navigable lane between the Accord's interior systems and the outer cluster we claimed about 4 centuries back, and controlling it reduces transit times by a factor of 3 compared to the alternative routes through the nebular margins on either side. The 2 gas clouds that flank the corridor are dense enough to make navigation through them slow and hazardous for large fleet movements, which means that whoever holds the corridor's midpoint holds a meaningful choke on the most efficient route through the region. The human installation at the corridor's approximate midpoint was, at the time of the original notice, described in the Accord survey as a station of moderate tonnage, lightly armed, carrying a garrison of undetermined but not large size. The notice was comprehensive. It identified the applicable treaty framework, cited the Accord's filed territorial claim, specified the withdrawal deadline of 6 standard cycles, and described the consequences of noncompliance in the standard graduated language. It was filed correctly, transmitted correctly, and confirmed received. The human response arrived within the deadline window. It was 6 words. "We are not leaving, good luck." I have read those 6 words perhaps 100 times over the course of my 4 years on this docket. Every single time, I read them as what they appeared to be on the surface. A blunt, unsophisticated statement of refusal from a garrison that was, in the estimate of every analyst, reviewer, and senior official who had ever opened the file, simply not significant enough to require an immediate forceful response. 6 words is not a diplomatic communication. 6 words is not a legal argument. 6 words is the kind of response you send when you have already decided that the conversation is over, and you want the other party to know it without having to explain at length why you have decided that. What I did not consider, in any of my 100 readings, is that 6 words is also the kind of response you send when you have already decided what you are going to do with the time you just bought yourself. When the decision about whether to comply or not comply has already been made and is not interesting to you, and what is interesting to you is everything that happens next. The Accord did not, at the time of that response, act accordingly. I have read the contemporaneous administrative records from that period, and the explanation is genuinely not cynical. The Accord had, in the cycle following the corridor notice, more pressing concerns than a small station in a navigational lane that was valuable but not critical. The Pellerin front was active and consuming significant fleet resources. The Vorath succession was creating political instability in 2 allied systems that required diplomatic management. The corridor was a real interest but not an urgent one. The file was assigned priority classification deferred pending, which in practical terms means it went into a category of outstanding disputes that receive periodic review but no active resource allocation. The understanding, never stated explicitly but present in every review memo I found in the archive, was that the station was not going anywhere and neither was the dispute, and that the Accord would address it when it had the bandwidth to do so properly. For 340 years, that moment never arrived. Or rather, it arrived dozens of times and was each time deemed not quite the right moment. I counted 23 formal reviews across the full docket span. Every single one confirmed the same status. The human installation remained in place, was not vacating, had not responded to subsequent inquiries about its intentions, and showed no sign of changing any of this. Every single one recommended a further deferral on the grounds that the strategic calculus did not currently favor an enforcement operation, and that the corridor, while valuable, did not justify the cost of clearing it by force at this time. 23 reviews, 340 years, and in not one of those 23 memos did a reviewer ask, what has the installation been doing during these intervals? What has it been building? What has it been learning? I know this because I wrote the summary of all 23 reviews for one of my 47 documents. I have now read my own summary, and I know exactly what question was missing from it. The balance shifted 3 cycles ago when 3 of the outer cluster systems petitioned the Council. They had development plans that assumed Accord control of the transit lane. They had been waiting for the corridor to be cleared for decades. They had political leverage accumulated from years of patience, and they applied it in coordinated terms that the Council could not ignore. The Council formed a task force. I was appointed lead document specialist because I had been on the docket longer than anyone else on the available staff, and because the relevant treaty framework was complex enough that they wanted continuity of expertise. We spent 2 years building the case. Then the Ninth Consolidation Fleet was assembled at the Pale Threshold staging ground. 411 vessels. I will list them because the number matters and because the archive should have the record. 1 flagship dreadnought, the Consuming Theorem, carrying Fleet Commander Ordath Sal and her staff. 12 capital assault carriers, each equipped with a siege sphere emitter array of the first-class specification. 68 line cruisers. 114 forward frigates, 104 support and interdiction vessels of various configurations, 112 tender, logistics, and specialist craft, including the quiescent Meridian, the trade and diplomatic tender to which I was attached. The fleet's tonnage was, by any reasonable calculation, overwhelming against the target we were addressing. The assessments I had reviewed, and I had reviewed every assessment produced by the Military Intelligence Directorate over the preceding decade, were unanimous on this point. The station had been in place for 340 years. However well maintained it might be, the technology it had been built with was 3 centuries old. Its weapons systems, its shield generation, its structural configuration, all of it was derived from human military architecture of 340 years ago, which was not, in the Accord's Intelligence Directorate's assessment, meaningfully comparable to current Accord fleet capability. I believed those assessments. I had no particular reason not to. I was a trade liaison, not a military analyst, and the Military Intelligence Directorate had been in the business of assessing threats for longer than I had been alive. Fleet Commander Ordathsal briefed the senior staff and attached observers on departure day. She was tall, composed, the kind of officer whose authority reads in the way she stands in a room rather than in anything she says. 42 years of active service, 18 documented enforcement operations, all of them resolved within projected parameters. She had been selected for this operation specifically because the Council wanted it handled definitively and without the kind of costly imprecision that creates political complications afterward. A clean operation, a clear resolution. She explained the siege sphere doctrine with the matter-of-fact precision of someone explaining a well-maintained tool. I have the briefing recording, and listening to it now is an exercise in a particular kind of retrospective discomfort, because every sentence is correct. Every sentence accurately describes how the doctrine works and why it is effective. And none of the sentences address the question of what happens when the target has spent 3 centuries studying the doctrine and building specific answers to it. The physics envelope, which everyone calls the siege sphere, is generated by the coordinated output of 6 or more capital-class emitter arrays, positioned in a specific formation around the target zone. When the formation is correct and the emitters are synchronized, the field they produce rewrites the operational constants inside a defined volume of space. Gravity gradients are altered, not dramatically, not in a way that would affect gross structural stability, but enough to shift the targeting solutions of weapons systems calibrated to normal space gravity. Light propagation rates are shifted by a factor that Accord systems compensate for but that target systems, calibrated to normal space, cannot. The electromagnetic transmission windows that most weapons systems use for their targeting lock functions are narrowed, increasing the time required to establish and maintain a weapons lock, and reducing the effective rate of fire of most conventional systems. The field does not stop weapons fire. It degrades the efficiency of weapons systems designed for normal space. The Accord systems are designed to compensate for the field's effects, so they operate normally within it. The target systems operate at a fraction of their intended capability. This asymmetry is the doctrine's entire operational premise, and it has been valid for 46 prior applications. The sphere requires 11 minutes to reach full coherence. During those 11 minutes, the effects build progressively. The first 2 minutes produce measurable degradation, increasing through the deployment window until the full field is constituted. This gradual onset is a design feature rather than a limitation. A rapid activation would create catastrophic feedback in the emitter arrays themselves. The slow build protects the equipment. It also, as will become relevant, creates a predictable geometry inside the forming boundary during the deployment window, predictable to anyone who has watched the formation activated enough times to understand the stress node pattern of the triangle pair arrangement. The sphere's formation requires the 6 emitters in a specific geometric relationship to one another. Triangle pair, 3 emitters in an equilateral triangle, a second set of 3 rotated 60 degrees relative to the first. The combined six create a hexagonal arrangement that produces stable field coherence. It is the most reliable configuration the doctrine has identified across 47 applications. The geometry of the triangle pair formation is not a secret. It is the standard. It has been the standard for long enough that every tactical officer in the Accord's fleet has trained on it, and every engagement where the doctrine has been employed has used it, and anyone observing those engagements from outside, from a corridor with a good sensor array and 3 centuries of patience, would have mapped it completely. Ordath Saul concluded her briefing with an assessment of the timeline. The fleet would arrive, issue the standard final notice with a compressed window given the station's evident age and likely minimal staffing, deploy the sphere on the assumption that the notice would not be complied with, and bring the engagement to resolution within the operational projection. She was confident in the timeline, the way you are confident in something that has worked 46 times. Ordath Saul concluded the briefing by addressing the civilian attachés directly, which was courteous of her. She told us that the operation was expected to resolve in a single engagement window, that the station's age and configuration did not suggest a capacity for prolonged resistance, and that our post-operation documentation work would likely begin within 48 hours of the fleet's arrival at the corridor. She said this in the tone of someone describing a schedule, not a prediction. The certainty was implicit, total, and shared by every person in the room. I know it was shared because I looked at the faces of the other 3 attached observers when she spoke, and what I saw was the mild, patient attention of people waiting to hear confirmation of something they already knew. The transit took 9 days. I used the time to finalize my documentation, the post-operation paperwork, the territorial absorption templates, the resource survey forms pre-formatted for the corridor's specific navigation bands. I was more prepared for the administrative aftermath of this operation than I had been for any operation I had supported in 11 years as a clerk liaison. I had 6 copies of the territorial survey ready. I had the forms indexed and cross-referenced. I had a projected timeline for the post-clearance administrative sequence that I had reviewed twice and was satisfied with. On the 5th day of transit, I reviewed the timeline a 3rd time because I found a sequencing issue in the survey submission protocol and wanted to correct it, and I spent approximately 2 hours on a problem that amounted to a filing order preference. I was that thorough. We all were. I want you to have the picture of that completely, because it is important to the record. A civilian clerk on a military tender, 9 days out from an enforcement operation against a 340-year-old station, correcting the sequencing in his post-operation filing protocol. I want you to have it because it is the most accurate representation I can give you of the institutional confidence that the Accord carried to the Keth corridor, and because that confidence had a very long foundation and was not, at the time, unreasonable. 23 reviews, 46 of 47 sphere applications, 47 documents, a fleet of 411 ships commanded by the Accord's most capable flag officer. The confidence was not hubris. It was the product of a long record of results in comparable situations. The situation, as it developed, was not comparable. The corridor mouth came to sensor range on the 44th day of the 7th cycle. Ordath Saul had invited senior attached observers to the bridge of the consuming theorem for the approach, which was standard practice for politically significant enforcement operations. There were 4 of us standing at the back of the bridge, myself, a senior cartographic specialist, one of the diplomatic advisors, and a representative of the Outer Cluster Systems Consortium, who had been instrumental in pushing the Council to act. I remember the cartographic specialist had a stylus in his hand, as if he expected to begin annotating charts at any moment. I remember the consortium representative was dressed in formal administrative attire, the kind worn to ceremonies rather than to operational briefings, as if this were an occasion to present oneself well rather than an occasion to watch a fleet engagement. I had my data reader. The completed forms were on it. The Keth corridor is, as a physical space, narrower than it appears on navigation charts. The two stellar nurseries flanking it produce enough gravitational and electromagnetic interference that the clear transit lane is perhaps 50,000 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, adequate for fleet movement but not comfortable, and the corridor walls on either side are visible on the long-range display as a continuous murk of gas density, an noise that our sensors could not penetrate with useful resolution. This matters because it means that anything positioned at the corridor's midpoint can observe everything entering or exiting from either end, with no concealment possible for a force of our size, while the corridor's flanking environment provides significant sensor shadow coverage for a small installation with low emission systems. The station had known we were coming well before our sensors detected it. This was not a tactical insight I had in the moment. It occurred to me during the withdrawal, when I was reviewing the geometry. The station had a structural surveillance advantage over any approaching force simply by virtue of being where it was, and it had occupied that position, with presumably improving sensor capability, for 340 years. The approach therefore had a quality that I did not fully appreciate at the time, but that I understand now. We were never approaching an installation that didn't know we were coming. From the moment the Ninth Consolidation Fleet entered the corridor's effective sensor range hours before we detected the station knew the fleet's composition, its formation, its approach vector, its speed, and its doctrinal configuration. It had all of that data before we transmitted the final notice. The 44-second response time was not the minimum time required to formulate a response. It was the time the station chose to wait before responding. It could have responded to our approach from the moment we entered the corridor. It chose to wait for the formal notice, and it chose 44 seconds as the interval, long enough to register that it had heard the notice, short enough to communicate that it had been expecting the notice for a very long time. Threshold Station Ardent appeared on the tactical display at approximately 412,000 kilometers. I watched Verath Solith, the tactical officer, compact and meticulous, a decade in the role, absorb the return. She did not say anything for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Commander, the station profile does not match the archived survey." Ordath Sol covered the distance to the display in 3 steps. I moved without deciding to move and found myself at the display a moment later, close enough to read the sensor returns directly. The archived survey described a station of moderate tonnage with an 11-point weapons signature and a structural profile consistent with a standard human deep space installation of its period. What the sensors were returning was a structure approximately 3 times that volume. The hull profile was not smooth and uniform. It was built up in visible layers, the seams between construction phases readable in the structural density returns, like the rings of a tree. Here the original station, here the first major expansion, here the subsequent reinforcement, here the heavy-grade hardening that the sensor's materials analysis classified as military specification alloy composite of a type not in the Accord standard library. I want to pause here and describe what I felt looking at those returns, because I think it is part of the record. What I felt was not fear. Fear was not available to me yet, because I did not have the context to understand what I was looking at. What I felt was something closer to cognitive disorientation, the specific discomfort of having a clear picture of a thing in your mind, and then having the actual thing presented to you in a form that does not match the picture, and the mind's attempt to reconcile the two. I had the survey in my head. I had been reading it for 4 years. I had 47 documents that referenced and relied on it. And the sensor returns were showing me something that was related to the survey, the way a grown tree is related to the seed it came from, recognizably derived from the same source, but transformed by time and sustained attention into something the original did not predict. The structural analysis continued to update as we closed range. The materials composition of the outer hull additions was not consistent with human military engineering of 340 years ago. It was not consistent with human military engineering of 200 years ago. Some of the most recent additions, the outermost reinforcement layer, and 3 specific hardening sections that the structural sensor identified as post-installation modifications to an existing frame, used material processes that the Accord's materials library classified as either very recent human military-grade alloy or an independently developed equivalent. Whatever this station had been when it was built, the version that existed now was the product of sustained, technically sophisticated work that had continued into the recent past. This was not an installation that had coasted on its original engineering. It had been actively improved, probably continuously, for at least the past 100 years and possibly longer. The weapons signature sweep that Varath Solith ran twice, because the first result appeared to her to be a processing anomaly, returned 53 active emplacements. Against the survey's 11. Against the survey that was 340 years old, and that had never been updated because no one had had the clearance or the access or the motivation to go close enough to threshold station Ardent to get a current reading. This last point occurred to me for the first time as I looked at those 53 signatures, and I want to record it because it is relevant to the institutional failure I am describing. No one had gone to get a current survey. In 23 reviews over 340 years, no one had commissioned a sensor pass to verify that the station's configuration matched the archive description. The archive description was the operating assumption, unexamined. We did not know what the station had become because we had not looked. Ordath Sal looked at the display for 11 seconds. Then she straightened and composed herself and issued the standard final notice in the correct form, as doctrine required. Identification of the fleet, reference to the authorizing docket, reference to the original ultimatum as the governing instrument, notification of the final window, specification of the protected terms for voluntary evacuation. 44 seconds later, the station responded. Not 44 minutes, 44 seconds. Every officer on that bridge heard the timing and understood what it meant. The station had been tracking our approach. It had the response ready before we transmitted. It had been ready, in all probability, for much longer than the 9 days we had been in transit. The voice was audio only, single speaker. I will try to describe it accurately because it is important to the record. Not young, not old, settled somewhere in the middle. The voice of someone who has been in a given place for a long time and is entirely comfortable there. Level and unhurried in the way that is different from careful. It was not the levelness of a person choosing words deliberately. It was the levelness of someone for whom the statement is simply factual, and the facts do not require decoration. Ninth Consolidation Fleet, this is Threshold Station Ardent. We received your notice. We also received the first one 340 years ago. Our answer is the same as it was then. We are not leaving. If you want this corridor, come and take it. We've had a long time to think about how that conversation goes. We're ready. We've always been ready. Come and take it if you think you can. The channel closed. Ordath Sal looked at the display for another moment. The station was not powering down. It was not changing its position. Its weapons signature readings were not showing the reduction patterns that indicate systems transitioning from ready to standby. They were showing the increase patterns that indicate systems transitioning from standby to active. She gave the order to compress the window and begin sphere deployment. I want to describe the next period of time precisely. Because the sequence matters, and I intend this record to be a technical accounting, as well as a personal one. The 6 emitter carriers moved to formation. Triangle pair geometry, textbook positioning, the standard configuration for a target zone of this estimated class. The formation came together over approximately 4 minutes. The carriers holding their position while the consuming theorem and the fleet's major combatants arrayed in the supporting formation that doctrine specifies, the flagship at the leading vertex, the capital assets distributed across the flanking positions, the frigates in the outer ring, the support vessels held at safe distance from the forming boundary. The emitters began their activation cycle. I watched the bloom begin on the tactical display, the soft expansion of energy around each emitter's position, the 6 blooms slowly growing, reaching toward one another in the pattern that would merge at full coherence into a single continuous field. The display showed the field coherence meter in the lower sector of the screen, a graduated arc that moved from 0 toward the 11-minute mark. I want to describe what the forming boundary looks like on a tactical display, because some readers of this record may not have seen an activation sequence, and the visual detail is important to understanding what the station did and what it required in terms of knowledge to do it. The forming field is not a sphere in the way that a bubble is a sphere, a uniform surface at a uniform distance from a center point. It is a resonant structure, and its surface is defined by the interference patterns between the 6 emitter outputs. The result is a shape that bulges and narrows, following the interference geometry, with 6 areas of highest stability, the antinodes of the interference pattern, and 6 areas of lowest stability, the stress nodes, where the interference produces partial cancellation. The stress nodes are the weak points of the forming structure. They are defined entirely by the positions of the 6 emitters and by the frequencies at which the emitters are operating. If you know the emitter positions and the operating frequencies, you can calculate the stress node locations to within a few meters. The station knew the emitter positions within minutes of the carriers moving to formation, because the positions are observable by sensor. The station knew the operating frequencies, because it had spent 340 years observing the Accord's exercises in the outer systems, and had a complete frequency library. The stress node locations were therefore calculable. And if the stress nodes are calculable, the anchor-round targets are calculable. Place a mass anchor at each stress node, and when the sphere tries to complete its formation, it finds 6 points inside its own boundary that are fixed to external space. The field cannot incorporate them. The energy it puts into the attempt propagates back through the field's own interference structure as a standing wave of increasing amplitude. The field tears itself apart. This is what happened at 7 minutes and 49 seconds. This is what the station had been building toward since the first emitter carrier moved to position. Not a reactive response, a prepared one. The anchor rounds were loaded and targeted before the sphere deployment began. The station had been waiting for the formation to commit so that it could not easily abort. It was at approximately 4 minutes and 12 seconds into the deployment, just past the 1/3 mark of the 11-minute window, when the station fired. Not at the fleet, not at the emitters, at the field boundary, at 6 specific coordinates inside the forming envelope. Verath Solith said, "Contact. Station is firing inside the forming boundary. 6 rounds, 6 targets, tracking," and then a pause of about 2 seconds during which I watched her hands working the display and her face doing something that I can only describe as a controlled attempt not to show a reaction that she was having. Then she said, "Anchor-type devices, mass anchor devices. They're targeting the stress nodes of the triangle pair formation. Commander, they are placing gravitational anchor points at each stress node." Ordeth Sal said, "Abort the formation." Verath Solith said, "Abort at this activation depth risks emitter damage in 3 of the 6 arrays. The emitters are already at stress resonance with the forming field. A clean abort would require controlled shutdown sequencing that takes longer than the anchors will need to." At 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the field coherence meter stopped advancing, and the resonance diagnostic went from green to yellow. At 6 minutes, it went to red. At 7 minutes and 49 seconds, the display showed a complete coherence collapse signature. The siege sphere failed, the first time the doctrine had failed in 47 applications. And here I want to take time with the word failed, because what it looked like from a bridge deck is not well captured by the word. A siege sphere failing is not a system switching off. The energy that had been carefully built inside the boundary over nearly 8 minutes, the altered gravity gradients, the shifted propagation rates, discharged into the surrounding normal space all at once when the field lost coherence. The discharge was a gravity pulse and a propagation surge, and something else that the consuming theorem systems logged as a dimensional resonance event, which is not a classification I had encountered before in any briefing document, and which the engineering section could not explain fully in the time available. I felt the gravity pulse in my legs. They tried to move in a direction that my body was not expecting, and that the floor did not accommodate, and I grabbed the edge of the tactical display I was standing beside and held it, and the display held. The propagation surge came through the viewport feeds as a 2.3-second distortion across the entire visible sensor range, a wash of anomalous light speed data that the targeting systems were not designed to compensate for because no one had written a compensation protocol for their own weapon turning inside out on them. 31 of our ships were inside the field boundary when it failed. 14 were destroyed in the immediate discharge. The gravity pulse exceeded the structural tolerances of 3 of them outright. The propagation surge triggered weapon system detonations in 4 more via the fire control loops that assume constant lightspeed propagation. The combined effect killed the remaining 7 through cascading power failures that the redundancy systems could not contain. 12 more were disabled or severely compromised. 5 came through more or less intact. 14 ships lost in 8 minutes from the failure of a weapon we had brought to use against the station, triggered by 6 precise shots from a station that had spent 340 years learning the geometry of that weapon's weakest points. Ordeth Sal did not pause. I want to record this clearly. She did not pause, she did not hesitate, she assessed what she had and she used it. She ordered direct fleet engagement, all remaining combat-capable vessels, conventional weapons, full rate of fire. She had 362 ships still capable of fighting. She sent them all. 362 ships firing simultaneously is not an abstraction. The consuming theorem vibrated at a frequency I felt in my chest and in the soles of my feet. On the visual feeds, it was an event that did not look tactical. It looked like the moment a star begins its collapse, a convergence of everything from every direction at a single point. The point was Threshold Station Arden. Verath Solith, watching the impact signatures, layered barrier architecture, multiple interdependent barrier layers, not a single envelope, outer layers absorbing and redistributing. The inner layers are receiving distributed load across a grid. Commander, to saturate the grid we need simultaneous full surface coverage with no gaps. Our current array distribution pattern doesn't achieve full surface coverage because we don't know the grid geometry. The survey data is 340 years old. What do we need to know the grid geometry? We would need a current survey. We don't have one. We're working against an unknown architecture. So we were. And the station, while it absorbed the fire from 362 ships onto barrier layers it had designed specifically for this purpose, opened its return engagement. The 53 active emplacements that the initial sweep had found were 53 active emplacements. As the engagement progressed, additional signatures came online, dormant emplacements. Systems that had been configured to present as non-weapon systems to sensors calibrated to standard accord detection parameters. Systems that had apparently spent, however, many years of preparation, powered down to the specific signature level that the Accord surveys classified as maintenance systems or power infrastructure, rather than weapons arrays. The total came to 61, then 74, then 88, then, at the 20-minute mark of the direct engagement phase, 109. The variety of those 109 systems was the problem Verath Solith spent most of the next hour trying to articulate without becoming audible. mass driver arrays at long range, where their kinetic velocity made conventional intercept unreliable, energy lance batteries at mid-range, cycling at frequencies our point defense was calibrated to handle, but not at the rate of fire the station was maintaining. Close defense clusters at short range, the kind of automated saturation systems designed for targeting maneuvering objects, which our frigates were, and the resonance bore weapons. I will spend time on the bore weapons because they are the clearest expression of what the station had spent 340 years becoming. A bore weapon does not operate like a conventional directed energy system, which delivers energy to a target, and the target absorbs it or deflects it or is overwhelmed by it. A bore weapon delivers energy to a target's shield layer at the specific resonant frequency of that layer, the frequency at which the layer's own structural coherence becomes a liability, the way a bridge can be made to oscillate by a force cycling at its resonant frequency, until the oscillation tears it apart from within. Against a single-layer shield envelope, bore weapons are powerful but not extraordinarily so. Against the Accord's layered barrier architecture, which is derived from the same emitter array technology that generates the siege sphere field, bore weapons are extremely effective. They can work through the layers sequentially, finding the resonant frequency of each, destabilizing it, and advancing to the next. Verath Solith identified the bore signatures at the 24-minute mark, and her voice, when she reported them, had a quality that I can only describe as controlled. She said, "Commander, the station is employing resonance bore weapons. The frequency bands they're using, they're calibrated to our shield architecture. They know our specific shield generation specifications." Ordeth Sal said, "How detailed is the calibration?" Verath Solith said, "Detailed enough to have the frequencies pre-dialed in rather than running a sweep. These are not systems that found our frequencies during the engagement. They knew them before we arrived. This is what I kept returning to as I stood at the back of the bridge and watched the engagement unfold on the display and on the viewport feeds, and in the casualty counter that Verath Solith had running in the lower right corner of the main screen. They knew our frequencies. They knew our formation geometry. They knew our detection parameter defaults. They knew the siege sphere doctrine well enough to plant anchor rounds at its stress nodes before the formation was fully committed. Not because they had intelligence sources inside the Accord's fleet command, or at least, I cannot establish that they did, but because they had watched. 3 centuries of watching the Accord's doctrine exercises in the outer systems. 3 centuries of collecting energy signatures from Accord ships transiting the corridor approaches. 3 centuries of building a picture of an enemy from the outside, which is sometimes a more complete picture than the enemy has of itself, because the enemy is inside its own assumptions and cannot see them from the outside. The ships that had been inside the boundary when it failed were the bore weapon's first targets. Compromised shielding is easier resonance to find and faster to destabilize. 4 of the 5 intact survivors from the collapse died in the first 12 minutes of the direct engagement phase, their inner barrier layers failing in sequence as the bore sustained its frequency lock. Then the bore weapons began working on the undamaged ships. Ordeth Sal's response was doctrinally correct. Constant formation changes, varied approach vectors, bearing adjustments every 3 minutes, unpredictable repositioning designed to force the bore weapons to break their locks and restart the frequency-finding process. It slowed the loss rate. The bore weapons fire control tracked the formation changes and redistributed targeting without losing established locks, because finding a frequency takes time, but tracking a target through 3-dimensional space is a simpler problem than the physics of resonance destabilization, and the station systems were good at both. The locks held through repositioning. The counter maintained on the display. I watched that counter and I thought about the doctrine briefing, 46 of 47. I had heard the 47th, the one that had exceeded its projected window by a factor of 1.3, mentioned only in passing, as a minor anomaly, the one case where the target had partially anticipated the approach. I had not asked what partially anticipated meant in practice. I had not asked what partially had looked like in the engagement records. These seem, in retrospect, like the questions of someone who understood that the doctrine had failure modes, and I had not understood that because the record I was working from was a record of 46 successes and 1 near success. The station's weapons systems had an additional property that became apparent around the 30-minute mark of the direct engagement phase, when Varath Solith noted that the Boer weapons frequency finding rate had increased significantly compared to the opening engagement. She did not immediately explain what she meant by this, and I did not interrupt her while she was working, but later, much later, during the withdrawal, she told me what she had observed. The station's Boer systems were learning during the engagement, not in the sense of a simple recalibration, but in the sense of a system that was building a frequency map of our fleet's shield architecture as the engagement progressed, identifying the common harmonic relationships between our ship's individual shield frequencies, and using those relationships to reduce the sweep time required to find each new target's resonant frequency. By the 40-minute mark, the Boer weapons were locking onto new targets approximately 40% faster than they had been in the first 15 minutes. They had learned from our fleet in real time how to defeat our fleet more efficiently. Varath Solith found this interesting in the way that people in her profession find things interesting when they encounter something they have not seen before and wish they were not seeing it now. She said, "The Boer systems have adaptive frequency mapping. They're building a harmonic model of our fleet architecture and using it to reduce target acquisition time. This is not standard doctrine for Boer-type weapons. Commander, the longer we stay in range, the faster they kill us." Ordath Sal absorbed this and ordered the repositioning rate increased and the outer frigates to begin secondary intercept protocols against the Boer emitters. The intercept protocols reduced the Boer fire rate by about 15%. The adaptive mapping meant that the 15% reduction was offset by the acquisition time improvement within 6 minutes. We were falling behind a curve that the station had designed to increase its gradient as the engagement progressed. 42 minutes in, Ordath Sal deployed the reserve emitter carriers. 6 carriers held back from the sphere deployment. Not for another sphere attempt. She was not going to make the same approach twice against a target that had demonstrated it knew the approach geometry precisely. She ordered the emitter arrays deployed in direct fire mode. The arrays as directed energy weapons rather than field generators, a lower efficiency application but one that didn't require coordinated formation and didn't create a predictable field boundary that could be disrupted with anchor rounds. The close defense clusters tracked the carriers as they moved to assault position. 3 were destroyed before reaching optimal range. The 3 that survived fired. The burst hit the station's inner barrier layer directly. On the close sensor visual feeds, I saw the station move, an actual physical oscillation in the structure. The kind of movement that means something significant inside it absorbed an energy event it was not fully designed to contain. The inner barrier layer showed fracture signatures on the display for approximately 4 seconds. I believed the layer had broken. The fracture signatures stabilized. The inner layer had a self-repair function, a distributed repair system that could redistribute the load from a failed section across adjacent intact sections while the failed section regenerated. Of course it had a self-repair function. It would have been a significant design omission not to include one. The 3 emitter carriers that had survived to fire were destroyed by the close defense clusters in the seconds after their discharge. At 1 hour and 7 minutes from the beginning of the engagement, Fleet Commander Ordath Sal ordered withdrawal. The casualty count was 217 ships destroyed or disabled beyond combat capability. 217 of 411. I want to state that clearly because I want the number in the record exactly. More than half the fleet. More than half. against a single station that our pre-operation assessment had classified as a relic of minimal strategic concern. I watched Ordath Sal give the order. I had been watching her for the full duration of the engagement, and I will not pretend to know what was in her mind, but I can tell you what I observed in her face and in her posture when she spoke the withdrawal order, and what I observed was something that I think the record should preserve. She did not appear defeated. She did not appear shaken in the way that people are shaken when something they thought impossible has just happened. She appeared to be a person who had assembled all available data, reached a conclusion that the data supported, and acted on the conclusion. The conclusion was that continuing the engagement would produce additional losses without changing the operational outcome. The operational outcome was that the station could not be reduced with the force and methods currently available. These are not the conclusions of a defeated commander. They are the conclusions of a competent one. The defeat was in the situation, not in the commander. This is a distinction that I think will matter when the Accord's military review process addresses what happened in the Keth corridor, and I want to record it clearly. The failure here was not in the command. It was in the assumptions that the command was working from, which were the assumptions of every review team and every intelligence assessment over the preceding 340 years, which were ultimately the assumptions of an institution that had successfully deferred a problem long enough that the problem had become something the institution had not anticipated and was not equipped to address. Ordath Sal was handed a situation in which the relevant intelligence was a 340-year-old survey, and the operational doctrine had been preemptively defeated by a station that had been studying it for longer than the doctrine had been formalized. What she did with what she was given was correct. The surviving ships turned. The consuming theorem turned. 194 vessels began withdrawal vectors away from the Keth corridor. Several of those 194 would not complete the return transit in operational condition. The Boer weapons had done enough work on some of them that the damage would compound over the transit period, and several would require emergency deceleration and rescue operations before they reached Accord-controlled space. But they were turning. We were leaving. The station did not pursue. I want to record that with precision because I think it matters for what the station represents, not just for what it is militarily capable of. It did not pursue. It fired no shots after the withdrawal began. It made no attempt to extend the engagement. Its weapons signatures, Boer weapons, mass drivers, energy lances, close defense clusters, all returned to standby configuration in the first 2 minutes of the withdrawal phase, and by the time the consuming theorem had made its initial vector change, the station was operating at what I can only characterize as its normal ambient state. Running lights on. Systems at standby. Present. The channel opened. The same voice as before. Level and unhurried. I have played the recording many times since, and I cannot find anything in the voice that resembles triumph or relief or anything I would call an emotion at all. What it resembles is a technician reading instrument data. Ninth Consolidation Fleet. We'll be here when the next one comes. We've been here the whole time. Did you think we hadn't noticed you building the case? We had 3 centuries to watch the corridor traffic. 3 centuries to watch the doctrine exercises in the outer systems. 3 centuries to understand exactly what the Accord was going to bring to this address. You brought it. Now you know what we built in answer. If you send another fleet, it will need to be different from this one. We'll be watching. We've always been watching. The channel closed. The corridor entrance receded on the sensor feeds as the quiescent meridian, and the rest of the surviving fleet completed the withdrawal approach. On the long-range display, Threshold Station Ardent was a small symbol in the corridor's middle band, marked in the sensor legend with the designation of a human installation, the docket number 7741C, and the status notation that had appeared on every one of 23 reviews for 340 years. Installation in place. Status unchanged. Status unchanged. I am transmitting this record from a position I am not disclosing. If the Consuming Theorem's command staff becomes aware of this transmission before I have had the opportunity to present it formally, there will be difficult conversations, and I am choosing the order of those conversations deliberately. The complete record is attached. The sensor logs from the quiescent meridian's observation systems. The tactical display captures from the bridge of the Consuming Theorem for the period I was present, my contemporaneous notes, and the 47 documents I prepared over 4 years that authorized this expedition. I am including the 47 documents because I want the archive to have the complete accounting of what we believed we were doing. There are several things I want to state clearly before this transmission ends. First, the station's configuration is not the result of passive resistance or passive survival. Passive survival would look like an installation that maintained itself over 3 centuries, kept its basic systems functional, kept its crew rotated, and was there when the Accord arrived. What we found was not passive. Every system in the station's combat architecture is a specific, calibrated answer to a specific feature of Accord military doctrine and Accord military equipment. The anchor-round calibrations require knowing the precise stress node geometry of the triangle pair sphere formation, which is not publicly documented in the Accord civilian archives. The bore weapon frequencies require knowing the specific shield generation specifications of Accord capital-class vessels, which are similarly not publicly available. The dormant emplacement masking requires understanding the precise detection parameter defaults of Accord military survey systems. None of this is guessable. All of it is learnable if you watch long enough from close enough, with good enough instruments. They watched. For 340 years they watched the Accord's fleet exercises, the corridor traffic, the energy signatures of passing vessels, the doctrine applications in other theaters. Anything that was observable from a station positioned at the midpoint of the most direct lane between the Accord's interior and the outer cluster. They cataloged it. They modeled it. They built answers to it. The station is not a generic human defense installation that survived because it was lucky or because the Accord never got around to it. It is a machine built specifically to defeat the Accord's approach to the problem of clearing it. It is the physical record of 340 years of careful, patient, methodical attention to one question. What will the Accord bring, and what will we need to answer it? Second, the voice on the channel. I want to address it because it is part of the record, and because it tells you something important about the disposition of the garrison. The voice said we will be here when the next one comes, and then said we'll be watching, and then said we've always been watching. This is not a taunt. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it may read in transcript and I want to correct any misreading. It is not a taunt, and it is not a threat in the conventional military sense. It is an accurate operational statement. The station has been watching. It will continue watching. If another fleet comes built on the same doctrine, the station will have had the interval between this engagement and that one to extend its analysis of our approach, identify the adaptations our commander attempted, and build the next layer of response. The station is not finished learning. This is the implication I cannot escape, and I think it is the most important thing I am filing in this record. We did not send a fleet that was insufficient. We sent the Ninth Consolidation Fleet, one of the 3 most capable force packages in the Accord's current inventory, commanded by one of the 3 most capable fleet commanders in active service, equipped with a doctrine that has succeeded in 46 of 47 applications. The station defeated it, and then it told us that the next fleet will need to be different. It said this not as a bluff. It has no reason to bluff. It just destroyed more than half the most capable fleet the Accord has deployed in 3 decades, but as a technical assessment. The next fleet will need to be different because the station now knows the current fleet's methods and the station adapts. Third, and I will close with this, I have thought, during the hours since the withdrawal, about the people who built the first version of the answer. Whoever was on Threshold Station Ardent when our original notice arrived 340 years ago. Whoever sent the 6-word response, whoever looked at that response and understood it to be the beginning of a very long project rather than the end of a conversation, those people would have known that whatever they were building for people who would not be alive to see it used. The crew rotation on a deep space station in a contested corridor means that the garrison that fought this engagement is not the garrison that was there when the Accord sent its first notice. The work passed from crew to crew, generation to generation, each cohort receiving the accumulated knowledge of the previous cohorts and extending it. This is not unusual in itself. Long-term maintenance projects have continuity of this kind. What is unusual is the character of the continuity. They were not maintaining a station in the hope of surviving. They were not waiting for rescue or for a change in political circumstances that would make the dispute moot. They knew, with certainty, that the Accord would eventually send a sufficient force to end the dispute on the Accord's terms, and they decided 340 years ago that when that force arrived, they would have built the answer to it. Every crew that served on that station after the original 6-word response served in the knowledge that they were building something they might never use, that the fleet might not come in their rotation, that all their work might be for a crew not yet born, a crew that would one day receive a transmission from a fleet that had finally run out of deferrals, and that crew's job would be to execute the plan that 3 centuries of predecessors had built for them. This is a particular kind of patience that I find difficult to fully articulate. The patience of people who accepted completely that their work was for someone else's benefit and did the work anyway with full commitment because the work was right. I think also about the practical logistics of that work. The corridor is not close to human-controlled space. Supplying the station over 340 years, bringing in the materials for each successive expansion and reinforcement, the components for the weapon systems, the power upgrades, the barrier array generators, the bore emitter arrays, required either a sustained supply chain that the Accord somehow failed to detect and intercept, or a station that had the manufacturing capability to produce its own components, or some combination of the two. I do not know which, and this transmission is not the place to speculate about operational security details that are not mine to disclose, but I note the question because it implies that the station's commitment to this project was not merely philosophical. Resources were allocated. Decisions were made, repeatedly, over a very long time, by people who could not know whether those resources would ever be used for the purpose intended. They were used today. The investment, from whatever source and by whatever means it was sustained across 3 centuries, was used today, and it was entirely sufficient. We sent the ultimatum 340 years ago. They answered it in 6 words and then spent 340 years turning those 6 words into infrastructure. We spent 340 years filing documents about the infrastructure we intended to demolish. One of those is a more useful way to spend 340 years than the other, and I am the 31st trade liaison to have contributed to the less useful approach, and I am the first to say so under my own name in a filed record. The running lights of Threshold Station Ardent are visible on the sensor feed as I close this transmission, steady, even, the lights of a station that is present and wishes its presence to be known. The presence is the message. It was the message 340 years ago. It is the message now. Docket 7741C will receive a new entry. I do not know what the official entry will say. I know what I would write if I were writing it. Status unchanged. It always was. This is Clerk Liaison 2nd Grade Osith Tavan Verath, filing the complete record of the Ninth Consolidation Fleet's engagement in the Keth Corridor, with all attachments. Transmission ends.